Hello, everybody. Welcome. Good morning for those of you who are on the Pacific Coast and in the time zone. Good afternoon to our East Coasters and early afternoon / evening to our European friends. Thank you all for joining us today. You could be anywhere, and you've chosen to join us and learn what you can from our amazing panel of experts on what's happening at COP29 and what we can expect in the future and how we can sort of frame these discussions for ourselves as we move into the next year. My name is Lisa Ann Pinkerton. I'm your founder of Women in Cleantech and Sustainability. I'm also the vice chair now. And I run a PR company called Technica Communications. I also have a podcast called Earthlings 2.0, which we'll talk about a little bit later. I also am co-moderating this event with Max Joshua. Max, welcome.
Hey, everybody.
We have our agenda, so if we can scroll through that real quick. Max, you want to take this part?
Sure. So we have four amazing panelists today who've all dedicated themselves to making a climate impact in very different ways. So very curious to hear from them as we follow COP together. So we'll have 40 minutes of panel discussion. Lisa Ann and I are going to ask our panelists a variety of questions about COP and about translating COP into action. And then we're going to open it up to you, the audience, from 9:45 to 10 a.m. Pacific. This is all in Pacific time. And then we'll split into breakout rooms after that so that you can actually meet the panelists in smaller groups and ask them more detailed questions about your work. And then we'll all come back together just to say thank you and goodbye and some closing remarks.
Thanks,
back to you,
Max.
Lisa
Ann. So let's go to the next slide. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Women in Cleantech and Sustainability, we've been around for since 2010, so 14 years now. And we have a variety of events, both in person and virtual. We have mentorship and entrepreneurship programs and career development programs. We have a big TED style event that we do every year. And we have chapters in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, and London. So far, I bet you there's going to be more in a couple of months. So we're growing pretty quickly. It's a real pleasure to see the organization blossoming so beautifully. Next slide, please. We've all been on Zoom for years now, but just, baseline etiquette requests here. The main thing we want to point out is we would love for you to share your video. We'd love to see your lovely faces and share your LinkedIn profile in the chat. This is the best way for you to connect with everybody who's here. And I highly encourage you to connect with folks. And pro tip, send a little note message when you're connecting with someone and say, hey, it was great seeing you on the WCS COP event, because that's going to remind you how you met that person the next time you go look them up. And feel free to work with each other offline after you've connected, because it's all about relationships. Next slide. Technica Communications, that's my firm. We're also the sponsor of this event because this topic is so important to me. Like I said, we're a PR firm. We handle social media. We are an award-winning boutique firm that really focuses exclusively on clean tech and sustainability firms. And, there's some of our recent awards. So thank you to Technica for hosting and sponsoring this event. Next slide. Some upcoming events. We've got some virtual events like on November 20th, get AI into your mind and on your resume, embracing your power for good. And then the LA chapter and the San Francisco chapter are going to have holiday gatherings. So mark your calendars. And then if you remember, there's a virtual networking event on the 13th. That picture right there of the group is at our Verge happy hour from a couple of weeks ago. We had 140 people sign up for that. Pretty impressive. All right. Thank you for sharing your LinkedIn profiles. I love seeing that. Next slide. If you're not already a member, you can become one today. feel free to click on do that QR code. And if you do it within 24 hours of this event, you'll get full reimbursement for your ticket price today. That's a great deal. Next slide. Also, if you would like your corporation or your company to foot the bill for your membership, you can encourage them to become a member. You can use that QR code as well. And there's going to be links in the chat. Next slide. And of course, event sponsorship, just like what Technica has done. But next year, we're going to be having even broader event sponsorship offerings. So you could sponsor like the whole London chapter if you wanted to for a year, or the New York chapter, or the entrepreneurship events. Breakthrough Energy Ventures is already committed to sponsoring the entrepreneurship program for next year. So we're really, really honored and proud and excited about that. Next slide, please. I'm getting through all the ads for you. Okay, here we go. So Max and I are moderating. And Max, you raised your hand really quickly to help me lead this event. And I wanted to ask you, what was it about this topic that inspired you so much to take the lead?
Hmm. Well, I guess today I'm mostly just really excited to learn from these four women who are tackling climate change, as I said, in very different ways, because they have expertise that I don't, and I would just love to learn how they got there. As for COP itself, I think it can be quite hard to get a sense of what really happens in these massive climate negotiations, how it translates into local action, and how the decisions are made and the implementation, how the implementation is done is a bit of a black box to me. So I'm really keen to learn more. I'm here with two hats. So on the one hand, I'm a climate community organizer, and I'm trying to build a more inclusive workforce through Outing Climate, that's a nonprofit supporting LGBT professionals, and also with WCS. On the other hand, I've spent my whole career on detecting methane and carbon emissions with satellites. So my professional focus is really how can we provide the direct measurement that's needed to create accountability in emissions and in carbon and in ecosystem change. So I'm really keen to learn how these major climate agreements actually get made and implemented through COP, because that's kind of what I'm trying to drive towards with these data solutions.
Thank you, Max. Perfect. And I've introduced myself already, so I'm going to skip this part of me.
Okay.
Next slide, please. One thing I did mention is that I have a podcast called Earthlings 2.0. And what we're going to do is we're running an experiment today, and we may take the audio from this event and repurpose it for an episode on the podcast, potentially on December 10th. So be on the lookout for that, and you can use that QR code to follow the show. Let me know what you think. All right, next slide. Max, all you.
Okay, so as I mentioned, I really want to learn all about COP, how the sausage is made at the conference, and who better to tell us than Cecilia. So Ms. Cecilia Njoki Njenga has served in the UN for over 25 years. She's the Director of Intergovernmental Support and Collective Progress at the UN Convention on Climate Change. That's called the UNFCCC. And she's been negotiating hard this week at COP29. So she works to assess the collective progress towards the Paris Agreement and build consensus in negotiations with all the different parties, and then implement climate action. She is actually coming to us from Azerbaijan, where it's very late in the evening. So Cecilia, thank you for joining us after what I'm sure has been a very busy day. And Cecilia, I have an opening question for you as well. So there are many pressing many pressing issues on the agenda at COP, from climate finance to loss and damage to a global stocktake, and it's hard to even know where to begin for our audience. Can you tell us what are the biggest 2 or 3 topics that are under discussion at this COP?
Cecilia, I think you're muted. I'm going to stop you there. Sorry about
Okay.
that.
Can you hear me now? Yeah,
Yes.
thanks.
Okay,
Okay,
welcome.
thanks so much. Yeah, Max, we have a lot to do here. And really, we have a huge agenda. set for us, about 170 agenda items. These are across all topics, whether it's adaptation, mitigation, just transitions, loss and damage, and we have less than 10 days to go to the end of the COP. We started off at a very difficult moment with the great difficulties to adopt the agenda, but the mood now has softened and everybody is working hard. And I've watched a lot of, been in a lot of the negotiation rooms, and I've seen, great enthusiasm for negotiators wanting to see some progress in climate action. The centerpiece for this COP is finance. And the goal will be reaching an agreement on what we are calling an ambitious new collective quantified goal on finance. So agreeing on the new finance goal, of course, will be the real opportunity. And that's where a lot of people are galvanizing their efforts and their focus on. However, agreeing on the goal, although necessary, is not enough. So a lot of negotiators, both within the rooms and outside the COP process, who are meeting in the global climate action space, are saying that finance must at this time be aligned to the needs. We know about the 100 billion that has not been fully achieved, and therefore this new goal must not just be a figure, but it must be aligned to the real needs, whether of vulnerable communities, small island development states, etc. So this platform of COP29 is really an area where we can advance conversations on how what the Azerbaijani people are calling an enabling action finance COP, and especially focus on making sure that the finance discussions focus on the problematic areas, which is basically ensuring that finances will be accessible, finances will be transparent and will be applicable, and it will also be an opportunity to look at the existing financial mechanisms such as the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and the other new ones like the Loss and Damage Fund and other initiatives that are based on ensuring that communities are enabled and countries are enabled to make progress, such as technology transfer and capacity building. So that is one piece. Adaptation for me is the other piece. And this is very much focused to ensuring that we support developing countries and developing nations in a way that they become more resilient and that they can be able to respond in real time to the challenge of climate change. And therefore, aligned to the finance discussion will be calls for doubling adaptation finance and agreeing on a set of indicators to measure progress on adaptation actions. And what does this really mean? This means that countries must also be able to demonstrate that they have plans, so that these plans can be able to attract resources that can lead to locally led adaptation action, that communities can be empowered, whether it's communities that have recently been hard hit by the impacts of climate change and extreme weather conditions, etc. But also that women and indigenous people, and that the actions that are proposed have actually a gender responsive solution to the current problems that communities are facing. So it's quite broad in action, but I also want to mention here that another priority area will be the implementation of the Global Stocktake that was concluded at COP28 in Dubai, and coming up with guidance so that countries are now able to develop a new generation of what we call the nationally determined contributions, which are really national plans of being able to respond, whether it's in energy, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's on waste management, and a wide range of other topics, so that they start aligning action plans and responses to the Paris Agreement goal of 1.5 degrees centigrade. So these are just some of the topics. There are, as I said, 170 agenda items, and I can't elaborate all of them here, but you can imagine the amount of work we have to deliver here in Baku. Thank you.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got a busy 2 weeks there. Thank you very much for taking us through the global stocktake adaptation and how it can address the communities in the most need, and then those ambitious finance goals and the doubling of finance just for adaptation alone. That's amazing. Lisa Ann, I'll hand over to you to introduce our next speaker.
Oh yeah, I guess it would help if I was unmuted as well. Sorry, everybody. Wow, you'd think by now anyway, I've done enough of these. Um, Genevieve is our next speaker. She's the founding director of End Climate Silence, and she's also the author of The Language of Climate Politics, Fossil Fuel Propaganda, and How to Fight It. Genevieve, welcome to our event. Let me just spotlight you for everybody. Oh, no, this is why I'm not supposed to be doing these things. Okay. Um, uh, there you are. Perfect. All right. And the question we have for you is, so there's been there's a we have a lot of challenges around public perception related to climate change, and we know it's this distant threat, but also an immediate crisis that just is continuing to show itself, quite frankly. So, how can we improve what the how can we improve the social movement around climate change to address this at scale as we need to?
Well, that, of course, is the million-dollar question. I think it's really important to understand that the electorate, at least in the United States, is segmented into different kind of affects with respect to climate change. I like to use the Yale Program on Climate and Communications rubric of global warming's 6 Americas that ranges all the way from the dismissives, people who say it's a hoax, as does our new president, all the way to people who are explicitly alarmed about the climate crisis. They feel fear, they are concerned to the point of actual fear. And they very often understand this problem to be something that will take a social movement, pushing governments actually to pass policies that will not only lead to the development of clean energy, and the transformation of our systems, but the explicit phase out of coal, oil, and gas, which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said in its 2023 report, we will need to do if we want to halt global heating at a relatively safe temperature, which is to say 2 degrees Celsius or below. Now, my theory of change is not the same one that the climate communications community has had to date. Before this, the idea was to try to move the dismissive into the sort of curious column and to move the curious column into the concerned column and sort of try to create a bigger consensus. But the problem is that many, many people in this country actually do want the United States to reach their net zero goals by 2050. 69%, in fact, of Americans support the United States achieving net zero by 2050. The problem is that only 31% of Americans support phasing out fossil fuels. And that, of course, is a partisan number because very, very few Republicans are opposed or have any aversion really to fossil fuels. But it's also because 48% of Democrats support an all of the above energy strategy. So what I argue in my book, as you can see, which is over my left shoulder here, is that there's a sort of complex of fossil fuel propaganda that kind of dominates the language of climate politics, which actually creates the mainstream position and creates this kind of self-contradictory view about climate change, which is, yes, we want to fix it, but we can fix it and still use fossil fuels anyway. The problem is that position is untrue. So one of the ways that people maintain this position is by saying to themselves that climate change is not going to be that bad. We can just keep heating up the planet by using coal, oil, and gas. And mostly if you're in the wealthy world, this is going to be fine for you. The social justice, the ethical dimensions of that get shunted to the side. But basically the story, both without and within the climate movement, is that being wealthy, being white, being in the United States means that you're going to be protected from the harms of climate change, even as the planet heats up. So we don't really need to worry about fossil fuels. And this is totally untrue. So what I would recommend is that when you are communicating with an entity, a person, an institution, whoever, that expresses concern or alarm about the climate crisis, not people who are just disengaged, not people who are dismissive, but people who are concerned or alarmed, which is the majority in the United States. You take these extreme weather events that we're already seeing in the United States. In New York, one of the wealthiest cities in the world, we had a fire in Prospect Park inside our city. Our neighbor state, New Jersey, was on fire last week. We are starting to have to conserve water because we've been in a drought for so long. So take these, and this, one person died, excuse me. I was going to say that nobody died in this, but indeed one person died in this fire already. So what we have to do is see these extreme weather events that are already happening today, not as sort of one-off events or disasters that allow us to go back to normal, but as symptoms of a disease that needs to be caught and cured early before it spirals out of control, which is to say climate change is not like, I don't know, planetary diabetes, where you have a problem that you kind of manage using technologies. No, it's actually, according to Joel Gergis, the lead author of the first section of the IPCC's latest report, climate change is actually like a planetary cancer that needs to be caught and cured early before it metastasizes out of control. So you need to use what's already happening, the climate change we already have, not just to say climate change is here, because, sure, but that looks kind of manageable for many people, but to say, no, climate change is here. And if we don't catch it and cure it now, by phasing out fossil fuels, by getting the poison out of our systems, it's going to spiral out of control within the decades over the lifetime of our children, not our grandchildren, not future generations, our children. So that is the messaging I recommend.
Okay. Thank you very much, Genevieve. Really appreciate you being here. I love hearing that, how do I say this? Firm languaging. I'm like, this is what we have to do. Like, if you have a fever, you fix the fever. If you have cancer, you get chemotherapy. You don't just like pretend it's all going to be okay, unless you're someone like Steve Jobs and you think you can cure it with natural foods and that kind of thing. And didn't really work out for him. Thank you very much. Next slide. Let's introduce the rest of our speakers and get down to this conversation. Antonia is our next speaker, and I'm going to invite her to the virtual stage. She's an investigative journalist and writer of Uncovering Oil, founding director of End Climate Science. She's also written a couple of books: Black Tide, The Devastating Impact of the Gulf Oil Spill, The Tyranny of Oil, and The Bush Agenda. Also, she's got a course that she's been putting on at Tulane University and then soon to come to Johns Hopkins University, which I think is pretty cool, called the Fossil Fuels and the Climate Crisis. So welcome, Antonia, to our virtual stage. And, following up on what Genevieve was saying, I think one of the things that kind of gets under my skin, and I don't know about anybody else, but I'm going to assume other people are thinking this too. We've had 2 COPs in a row that were hosted by oil states. And I have heard that some of the decision making on where these COPs are hosted kind of is there's a committee, and there's one country in particular that certainly has veto power over where these can be hosted. And I heard that it was Russia, but I'm not confirmed with that. But I heard that they would just veto everything until it got to a place where it wasn't in Europe, right, or the United States. So I wanted to ask you, like, how are things being balanced at COP related to fossil fuel interests? We heard last year that there were a lot of fossil fuel deals being made at COP, which is also just seems antithetical to the whole event. So, how can we continue to have meaningful COP meetings while there also seems to be a heavy lobby influence from the fossil fuel players?
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I'm also, so for a few things, I am not the founding director of End Climate Science. That's Genevieve. And I founded a reporting program called Uncovering Oil. It's not a platform, it's a a program that I founded, and I'm an investigative journalist, and I write for outlets including Rolling Stone, The Guardian, The Atlantic, New York Times, and a number of others that are listed there. And I've been reporting on issues related to fossil fuels and communities that are impacted by fossil fuels for several decades now. And thank you for listing the titles of my books. And it's so wonderful to be with you all. I'm going to answer this question in a couple ways because where we had sort of thought we might start, and so I might actually go there to frame it, was a question of, is it possible to phase out fossil fuels? And then within that context, what does it mean that the COP is being hosted in Azerbaijan, clearly a country that is not only deeply dependent on fossil fuels, but is an autocratic state, and that it was hosted in Dubai last year, also a country with extremely limited civil society rights and human rights protections, and deeply dependent on fossil fuels. So I guess the place where I would start is to say, not only is it possible to phase out fossil fuels, but all of the countries participating in the Conference of Party process committed to doing so at the last Conference of Parties in Dubai, of all places. So after decades of organizing and building of social movements and building of mobilizations and meeting at COPs and pushing the criticalness of tackling fossil fuels as essential and central to addressing not only the climate crisis, but all of the on-the-ground harms related to fossil fuel operations, the human rights toll, the health toll, the economic toll, the injustices, also addressing the political power of the industry that the dependence on fossil fuels maintains, that the only way to address all of these problems was to address fossil fuels. And it took a lot of work and a lot of organizing to make this not only accepted knowledge, but then accepted practice, so that at the last Conference of Parties in all places in Dubai, there was for the first time the mention of fossil fuels in the negotiated final statement and in the commitment to transition off of fossil fuels. So that is now something that all of the governments have committed to do, and they also have to implement and deliver to us their plans to do so. And then we have to try and hold them to that. And the central, there's several pieces that have to come into place to make that transition happen in a way that will be just. And I like using the F's and that for this. This is the fair, fast, feminist, and funded transition off of fossil fuels. It's a lot of F's, but it helps you remember them. And that one of the key pieces is funded, right? So if we're going to, as Cecilia started us off with, and that's what this whole COP is about right now that is taking place, which is how do we fund this process? How do we fund the ability of countries to both mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis and to create a fair transition? And that means that we have to help countries pay for either the transition off of fossil fuels or to leapfrog the fossil fuel stage of development, because we don't have time for everybody to follow along. And in that funded space, one of the most important pieces is that funding that transition creates fairness because it opens up so much more money. Fossil fuels are as expensive to produce today as they were 150 years ago. That's ridiculous from any sort of business perspective. Whereas renewables, of course, are dramatically more efficient, dramatically less expensive to produce and distribute than they were when they were first introduced. And also, when you look at polls, even in the United States of all places, most people across the board, conservatives, liberals, it doesn't matter who they are, love wind and solar. They want to see it implemented right away. What they don't quite understand yet is that it is very much in their economic interest to also abandon fossil fuels. And one of that is because fossil fuels are so expensive. And the reason why they're so expensive is because the industry has put all of its money, not into efficiency, but one, into very, very high salaries for its CEOs, very disproportionate to the rest of its workers. And it has fired a lot of workers. It's been shedding workers for decades. So it's created more efficient production in that it's not dependent on labor as much as it previously was, reducing jobs significantly. But it puts the rest of its money into going deeper, farther, into much more complex, technologically difficult, risky, and environmentally disastrous and human rights disastrous projects. So going deeper and deeper into the ocean, more into offshore projects, more into shale, deep into rocks, into boreal forests, into very expensive and complicated ways of getting at their product. And the reality of this is if we let them keep doing this, we used to talk, for those of you that are my age, and you can see my gray hairs poking out here, there used to be a conversation about peak oil, which was a reference to when we would reach peak production and then be at a downward decline. Now the discussion is about peak demand, that we will reach a peak demand of oil and then we'll be on a decline, because the industry has proven that if you let them, they will find oil, they will find gas anywhere and everywhere. And believe me, it's out there. If we let them go anywhere, it's out there. They'll find it. But that's if we think that there is zero cost to letting them do that. The further, the deeper, the more technologically complex the process, the more subsidies the industry requires, the more money it needs to spend on that process. The other problem with the fossil fuel industry that makes it so expensive now is that it requires highly centralized, large production processes that then have tentacles that have to span out. So if you think about energy production, for example, you've got a big centralized coal facility that's producing electricity or oil or gas. And to get it to you, to get it to us, it has to have these tentacles that reach out, that deliver the energy far and wide. That's expensive to put into place, but it's really expensive to maintain in the light of worsening climate crises. So when there's a storm, those electricity poles blow away, they go down, and we have millions of people who lose power, and then all the expenses associated with losing power and losing electricity and the lives that are lost from losing power and losing electricity. But when we have localized, centralized, renewable energy systems, if I have a solar panel on my house that I'm getting power from, it doesn't have to travel anywhere. It doesn't have to be rebuilt. I have energy that is provided locally. It has less distance to travel. It's less expensive. It's more reliable. It's more efficient. It's more sustainable. And that is particularly true the more that we look at energy justice. How do we distribute energy equitably around the world so that everybody has access to the energy that they need? And that solution is renewables. It's localized, renewable, sustainable energy. It is not fossil fuels. So when we look at, is it possible? We have the tools that we need to transition off of fossil fuels. Different countries are going to need to go at a different pace, and that's also just. Those that can go fastest first must. And they cannot follow the path of the United States, which is to be the country that has one of the best capacity. We are in no way are economically reliant or dependent on fossil fuels as an industry. Yet we keep producing in record numbers. And it is right to call the United States out on its being hypocritical, deeply hypocritical for that, for continuing to produce. In order to, so the countries that can go fast and first must. It doesn't mean that every country all at once immediately shifts at the same time. We shift in a way that is those that can go first do and the fastest do, and we fund those that have a more difficult time, and we build up as rapidly as possible that just process that funds the transition and that makes those countries that can transition fast and most quickly do so. It is Yeah. So
Thank you, Antonia. I really
and I'll stop
appreciate
there.
it. We have lots more questions for you. Don't worry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry for going on.
I'm
Thank you.
really thrilled to have you here. Max, why don't you introduce our last guest and continue this topic with her?
Yeah, Antonia, thanks for taking us through some of the huge barriers there and the influence of the fossil fuel industry and the need for action by the most developed economies who've been benefiting from fossil fuels for, in the case of the UK, 150 plus years, right? Okay, Laura, I have a related question for you. So Laura Diaz is a senior associate with the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is an amazing nonprofit working on the energy transition. I actually collaborated with RMI in my previous job. And she works in their Global South program. So she's focused on capacity development programming, cohort learning offerings, basically building capacity with networks like the Climate Finance Access Network, CFAN, and Catalytic Climate Capital, channeling funding, all this finance that we've been talking about, to the areas that need it most in the developing world. She also manages the Women in Renewable Energy WIRE network, which is a professional development network for women across the Caribbean. And really cool, it'll be really cool to learn more about that. And she's based in Colorado, hence the snowy mountain background that she has over there. Hi, Laura.
Thank you, Max. Hi.
So my question for you is kind of about how we actually translate into localized action here. So what are the biggest barriers to actually supporting developing nations, such as the island nations you work with? What are the biggest barriers to actually getting finance to them? And how can COP29 and further COPs help unblock this?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Max. So I'll start off just discussing a little bit what Antonia left us on. We talked about funding. Those who can go fast first must. And we're colloquially just calling this the finance COP. So the barriers to me when we're thinking about small island developing states across the Caribbean, across the Pacific, across the Indian Ocean, we should be asking ourselves, where is this funding going? While we are seeing communities on the ground advocating for their personal plans, we also really want to think about how communities are being empowered to fund those plans that make the most sense for them. So in the context of island states, again, we know that island communities are most actively feeling the impacts of the climate crisis. For them, it is not a matter of when it is happening, it's a matter of how they are managing to live alongside the realities of the climate crisis. So I would encourage us to think about two funding opportunities, I suppose. So Max, you introduced me with a little bit of background on capacity development. I think funding for capacity development is perhaps chronically under discussed. I think there's a lot about climate funding that goes towards big, sexy initiatives for big countries. And when we talk about capacity development, it's really about encouraging funding for training and the empowerment of local communities. So those local economies in accomplishing the goals that they've set out for themselves. So when we're talking about the energy transition, more specifically, we're thinking about how we're empowering utilities or governments, ministries, nonprofits that currently are interacting with those communities on the ground, the people that are actively working towards their goals, that are looking for technical training, that are looking for networks, that are looking for knowledge exchange, or whatever combination of those programs they want to engage with to succeed. Cecilia also mentioned earlier about the value in empowering communities and responding in real time. Those communities have plans. How can we strategically source funding to support those plans? And I think that leads in really nicely to my other kind of advocacy point around funding for job creation. So we're not only looking to empower the folks that are already working towards a energy transition, that are already working towards climate goals, but we're also looking to add in funding for further expansion of that economy. So for example, I'll use one of the programs here listed, the Climate Finance Access Network. We have a training program that supports advisors that are salaried and embedded in local ministries across the Pacific and the Caribbean. And the value there is that you are creating a job within a local unit that can respond to the needs that they are seeing in that ministry or that government is working towards. So a little bit of a different approach from like fly in, fly out consulting models. Again, really thinking about how you are empowering a community to show up for themselves. And I'll pause there just in the interest of time.
That's really helpful overview. Thank you, Laura. Yeah,
Sure.
kind of the right models that are not exploitative, not just getting money rushing in, rushing out, but actually like sticking around and making an impact and supporting throughout the process. Yeah, it's great work. I want to ask a question about climate finance because, as Cecilia mentioned, this is the finance COP, right? There's been a huge amount agreed already. One of those big things is Article 6. So Article 6 is about establishing a global carbon market. There's 6.2, which is about bilateral agreements for trading carbon credits, and 6.4, which is about establishing like a centrally managed marketplace for carbon credits. For those of us who aren't directly working in carbon, this can be a lot to navigate and figure out how this works. I want to open it up to either you, Laura, or also Cecilia, depending on who wants to step forward. Can you tell us a bit more about the significance of Article 6 and this new centralized carbon market?
Okay, maybe I can go first because one of the tasks I have to do at the opening of the COP was to provide some advice to the COP president on whether the climate was actually right to adopt part of the Article 6.4. So the Article 6.4 is about the carbon markets, and when operational, these carbon markets will help countries implement their climate plans, and it's expected to be much faster, much cheaper, and of course, driving down the high emissions. And so the passing of the Article 6.4 at the opening of this COP has brought in a new era of better carbon markets that work for people and the planet. And basically what was adopted was really the modalities of how they will be operationalized. So they are important for the implementation of national climate plans. And I think that's where the big debate was. And what does this really mean for countries and developing countries that do not, or even at the moment, have well-developed markets, not just carbon markets? I think the negotiations that have been going on for quite a couple of years have been much more focusing on how can these carbon markets help drive finance that would be transformational. We are, of course, looking at the loss and damage as one fund, but how can the carbon markets lead to a much more transformational process of the much needed funding that would be required by vulnerable countries to address their climate crisis at the speed and also at the scale that is required. And here I'm looking at two important aspects. I mean, the Global Stocktake, one of the key outcomes of the Global Stocktake spoke about the need to triple renewable energy and ensure that many countries and communities across developing countries that currently do not have access to affordable and clean energy, that they actually do that. So what can the carbon markets do specifically for this? So carbon markets can help drive investments and offer new opportunities for financial flows towards funding new renewable energy projects in least developed countries. Again, the carbon markets, they are trading systems in which carbon credits are bought and sold with the aim of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's really the prime objective. And if that prime objective is kept in focus, then countries will be able to transfer their carbon credits which are earned from cutting their greenhouse gas pollution to help one another or one or more countries to meet their climate targets. And I think for me, that's, I mean, it sounds complicated. And I always get this question, what does this really mean for small economy? We talk about a country like Eswatini in Africa or Lesotho. You know, these are small countries which do not even have developed, markets. So really, I think it's still a work in progress. We were able to adopt the modalities, which is quite good. There is quite some more significant work that's currently ongoing in the negotiation rooms here in Baku. And the first one is around setting up or developing a benchmark of high integrity carbon markets, ensuring that they are secure from being that the integrity is secured, basically. And that will be very crucial if the countries will be able to reach an agreement around that. The second point I want to raise here is that the Paris Agreement credit mechanism that is also being negotiated will be the only one of its kind to provide support to vulnerable countries to adapt to climate crisis. And this is by diverting a share of the proceeds towards adaptation funding. I said in my opening remarks that adaptation for me is critical for developing countries. And therefore, if these carbon markets are to work, they must be able to have mechanisms like the crediting mechanism that will favor and will be directing the resources to adaptation. And this is talking about the vulnerable communities, whether it's in the small island development states or whether it's in the rural communities in India or in the Philippines or in Africa, that this credit system really favors them and that resources are diverted towards that direction. Perhaps I can provide an opportunity for my fellow colleagues within the panel to provide their views on this too. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia.
Yeah, would
Yeah,
anybody
Laura,
else like to?
as our representative on the ground, I was wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that as well. Just how
Sure.
for example, for island nations, how this adaptation funding can help, and is it reaching them quickly enough, I guess, as well?
Sure. I mean, I think Cecilia made really, really excellent insights to this. I think the one thing I'll add is something that's really helpful about Article 6 is that it allows us to, in the future, moving forward, think about more creative ways to open up funding flows to communities on the ground. So for example, in island nations, something that RMI as a whole hears a lot when we are working on energy projects on the ground is the challenges with funding. It's sometimes difficult for a local government to justify the investment in a particular project, but it's also kind of intimidating to bring in an outside funder. So what is that kind of blended finance model? What is the opportunity for us to think more holistically about how on the ground solutions are being funded? So I have to say, I think moving forward, this allows us to be more creative. And I appreciate the conversation that will come from this.
Thank you. I'd like to. I have a question for the whole panel, and anybody who else in this audience has a question for our panelists, please go ahead and put it in the chat, and we will cycle through them as we can. I think so. What? Okay, here's my question. As climate change continues to get worse, it'll be continually more expensive for countries to adapt and mitigate. And my concern is countries will be selfish, especially the largest ones, and spend more money within their borders than sending money to the fund to protect the most vulnerable nations from climate change. And so this is kind of a two-part question. So there's a concern there, and also, like, if you think about it, at the international level, we have basically international anarchy. This was what was a phrase that was coined by Aaron Theory in an interview I did with him. He's a climate activist for the podcast, and I was like, that's a really fascinating concept. Like, there's nothing that really force these countries to do what we know needs to be done. And it's all a negotiation, it's all agreements among countries. And so I'm curious to hear from the panel, like, how do we make COP this activity that really holds countries to account to be in action for climate change? Because I think a lot of people have a bit of a disillusionment around COP because they feel like it's just not doing enough, or it's moving too slowly, or it's like climate change mitigation by committee, which is basically then becomes like the lowest common denominator, the lowest thing we can get agreed upon. And so I know that's a very big question, but I think it's probably on a lot of people's minds. So I just wanted to throw it out there to our panel, and you're welcome to answer any portion of that question as you see fit. How do we enforce some of these things and really ensure that the work that these countries are committing to is going to be carried through?
Might be a great question for Cecilia if you're open to it.
Okay, I can give it a go. I think, one of the issues here is really about the complexity of our process. And, today we saw another country withdrawing their delegation from the COP. Argentina withdrew their delegation. And it's becoming very complex to see whether these multilateral platforms can really be sustainable. And that's really the test we are going to face this year and towards next year, as the geopolitical landscape of international cooperation, is shaken. I mean, it's being shaken due to various reasons. So we walk a very fine balance at the UNFCCC between respecting national sovereignty, which is what you have just mentioned, saying, why do I not focus on my own domestic problems? And on the other hand, pushing for collective action, because that's what multilateralism is. It's about bringing nations together to deal with a common global challenge. We also realize that every country has unique circumstances. And at this COP, the Africa Group has come again, I think for the fourth or fifth time, with a new agenda item talking about the special needs and special circumstances of Africa. But we are also seeing countries such as the small island development states saying we're also special. We have special interests. We have special circumstances. So all of us are special. And we have seen what has happened in Valencia recently. So both developing countries, everybody, each and every one of us is special when it comes to climate. We also know that climate change has no borders. So even if a country decides it's a national sovereignty issue or it's a national interest issue, we do know that the impacts in the neighboring country or neighboring community would impact on them. So the approach of the COP29 is really about that of flexibility and also combined with accountability. And therefore, we have a principle within the Paris Agreement that talks about common but differentiated responsibility, where, of course, there is historical issues, but there is also a certain level of responsibility that nations must take. And also trust amongst parties becomes very central when we are negotiating and when we are reaching consensus. So what do I do on a daily basis? Basically working with negotiators, with negotiating groups, and encouraging them to work with each other to pursue pathways, while at the same time upholding their common goals, which they want to reach consensus and which they want to pursue. For instance, the European Union have come up with what they're calling the CBAM. And there is a lot of debate whether CBAM is replicable in other parts or whether it to a great extent hinders international trade based on the green principles or greening various products. So it's about finding that sweet spot, and that's very critical. Why is that sweet spot that encourages ambition for climate while also respecting the national context? And this year, we are seeing greater alignment despite the geopolitical landscape shifts. And this is partly thanks to the Global Stocktake. And the reason I say that is because the Global Stocktake was a comprehensive, inclusive process that actually demonstrated to us that even after 5 years after the Paris Agreement, we are not where we are supposed to be. And something needed to happen in a transformational manner in order for us to reach where we are. So even when national states are not going to be supportive to the process of climate change through the UNFCCC process, we know that now cities, the city mayors, the governors of different states are starting to take action and come up with ambitious plans. They are starting to take action. They are moving to electric cars. They are moving to afforestation programs. We are seeing communities also taking action across countries and supporting each other. So there are different forms of partnerships. There are different forms of responses that are emerging, to address the gap that is being created by this, this process of national interests or state interests, et cetera, et cetera. So these are emerging, and I can feel the vibe here in Baku, and the various spaces I'm going to, whether it is on oceans or whether it's at conversations around oceans and climate, whether it's about the youth who are quite vibrant in trying to look for new innovative technologies that they can apply to respond to climate change. So that's what I can broadly say, is happening around here. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia. Antonia, would you like to weigh in?
Thank you. I just really wanted to piggyback off of Cecilia because it's so important what she just said in the context of your question, which is so critical at this stage, especially looking at the US election. We cannot abandon multilateralism. That's like just all I want to say. Like in the light of the US election, multilateralism is so essential. It's so key. It's difficult. It's time consuming. It's complicated, but that's why it's important. And it's not the only lever that we have. So when we look at COP as if it's some sort of, isolated, going to solve all our problems, this one big machine, that's the problem. It offers a tremendous amount of opportunity and hope, but it's just one piece of the puzzle of how we address this problem. And as Cecilia was saying, people are working at every level, and that's the work we have to continue. Local, state, federal, people are working in mobilizations and alliances. And one of the things they're doing within those movements is pushing for COP. And we have critical levers and opportunities through the United Nations that we don't have elsewhere for research, for uniting work through the country, through the world. But it's a process that filters down and filters up. And the more that we see it as part of that process, the better. In the United States, with the results of this election, we are going to see a resurgence of a group of countries that were united under Donald Trump the last time, and that was the US, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. And those are three countries that are deeply, deeply committed to the continuance of fossil fuel dominance. And they are also creating, messaging and working at influence on all sorts of levels. And that's where our commitment to multilateralism, not breaking ourselves into silos, is so important to be able to confront the power of what will be increasingly powerful siloed groups of countries working towards objectives that most of us, I believe, don't hold, at least from the perspective I can say of the incoming Trump administration.
Thank you, Antonia. That's really helpful perspective. And I too am hopeful about multilateralism. Like the UK and Brazil just agreed some really ambitious national contributions. And they did that, I believe, bilaterally because they sort of helped to spur each other on. So I really like those examples. I know that we're at the top of the hour here, and I know that you, Antonia, and Genevieve are going to have to leave while Cecilia and Laura, we're going to break into breakout rooms shortly. But I know Lisa and I kind of want to give each of you an opportunity to share a message with the audience that you'd like them to take away. I really wish this could last longer. I honestly feel like we're just getting started.
We are just getting started.
But still, it's been really good to hear from you. Genevieve, I was curious, what's giving you hope, and what would you like the audience to take away today, if there's one thing?
Well, I don't actually deal in hope. I think that hope turns our attention to things that we can't control. I only deal in what I take to be my duty as someone who has a lot of privilege and who has a certain amount of skill in communications and language to do everything that I can to contribute to the fight to get fossil fuels out of our systems and halt global heating. So I'm doing this so that I can live with myself and so that I can, be someone who I'm proud to have my son remember when I'm gone. And I think that if I start worrying about whether I'm hopeful or optimistic or despairing, it's just going to send me down a spiral of letting everything else control my equanimity. I think this is about responsibility. I think it's about love, and I think it's about duty. So that's all I want to say about that.
Thank you. And being in action is part of that as well. And that's the best antidote to anxiety, is being in action.
Anyway, thanks for inviting me to be on this panel. Goodbye, everybody. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Genevieve. And Antonia, can I ask you the same question? Obviously, you've shared your optimism about multilateralism, but on the takeaways for the audience, is there one thing you'd really like the audience to take away?
Yeah, I think I said the thing at the beginning is really the most important thing to me, that I believe that this work is possible. And I think believing in that possibility is maybe part of the responsibility that Genevieve speaks towards. That the fact that there are setbacks and defeats doesn't mean that the possibility is not there. And I do live in a world of hope. I find that word hopeful and helpful. That I find hope in spaces like this, that there are many of us that are working towards this shared goal, and being able to see each other and be in shared spaces is critically important. So I want to thank you so much for inviting me. And I look forward to the next event we all have together. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Antonia. And I would like to ask the same question to Cecilia and Laura too, but perhaps we'll save that for after the breakout rooms and just split into the rooms. Then when we come back together, we can ask you for your takeaways for the audience too. Does that sound good, Lisa?
I would just do the takeaways now,
Okay,
if you
sure,
don't
sure.
mind. That way we have it all together.
Laura, I'll ask you, what's giving you hope? You've already shared a little bit about sort of action on the ground, getting finance to the right places, running these local programs. But yeah, what's giving you hope, and what would you like our audience to take away?
Sure. Thanks for this question. So I think what's giving me hope, and Genevieve kind of alluded to this in her opening question, there are groups of people who just don't want to talk about climate change. And I think what gives me a lot of hope is those aren't the people I talk to. Like, those just aren't the folks that I'm trying to convince. There are far more people working towards this fight, working towards an energy transition, that are excited about climate solutions, even if they're not loud about it. I just don't deal with the deniers anymore, which is something that's really, really nice. I think once you hit that wave, I think there are far more people working towards this than we realize, and that gives me a lot of hope that the conversation has shifted a lot in the last 10 years. I went to graduate school for climate science, and at that time, a lot of the conversation was, how do we convince people that climate change is happening? And I don't know if that's the conversation we're having anymore, even in the US. It's not whether or not it's happening, it's what do we do about it? And the transition to that side of the conversation has given me a lot of hope.
Thank you. Yeah, that level of global acceptance, and that we just can't deny this anymore, it's encouraging. Finally we're there at least. Yeah. And Cecilia, the same question for you. You've already shared a lot about the really ambitious goals and the ambitious implementation plans as well that are coming out from this COP. So I get the sense that you are feeling quite hopeful. But yeah, what's inspiring you at the moment? And what would you like the audience to take away if there's one thing?
The highlight for me so far has been the visit I had this morning to the Youth and Children Pavilion. The level of confidence, the enthusiasm, the passion, the dedication of the young people that I met there, the vibe was just fantastic. There was a lot of expression of despair and dismay, but at the same time, they had key questions, they had ideas, they were enthusiastic, they reminded us of our responsibility, but they also had the palpable energy to say that we are ready to make a change if you can't. And for me, that's been the highlight of my moments here in Baku. So I'm really looking forward to going back next week, just before the end of the COP, and to feel the vibe again, and see the resurrection, and see that future generations, are concerned, but are also coming up with real solutions and are ready to take action if we do not take action. So that's really what's driving me here, and which will keep giving me the momentum. Thank you.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's really inspiring. I'm glad the youth is so energized. We need them. We need everybody. Yeah. I know that a lot of you have asked great questions in the chat. So what we'll do is we'll split into breakout rooms, one for Cecilia and one for Laura, so that we can go in there and ask them individually in more detail about their work. Because I saw a lot of the questions in the chat are sort of specifically targeted to both of them. So I can't remember who our breakout room producer is, but if you can help us get set up, that would be great. Perfect. Was there anything you want to add right now, Lisanne, before we split up?
I just feel, like I said, I have so many questions, and I'm going to hold my tongue until I get to the breakout room, because it's, COP it's a complicated thing, as we've all discussed. And I'm beginning to wonder if the quote unquote COP in enforcing these COP agreements, as Susanna Hill put it so well in the chat. Thank you, Susanna. It is these bilateral or multilateral agreements and the treaties that countries will have together, and maybe they start insisting on certain adherence to COP agreements as a part of those negotiations. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. All right, we're all going to go to our breakout rooms. I hope you all have a good time, and I'll see you on the flip side.
I had a follow on, but I don't want to get in line in front of somebody who hasn't asked a question.
Please continue. That's fine.
The follow on was onto a conversation that we were having in our breakout with Cecilia about who would take leadership if the US and Northern Europe don't. And Arila, I believe her name, was just talking about how microgrids and investment in the third world in grid technology was good. And it occurred to me, in terms of leadership, do we see a role that China is taking in that? I seem to remember they were extending economic power with programs throughout the regions that they are adjacent to in order to build good political capital. They were building out, say, the Silk Road, or they were building out, I think, some electrical in the middle parts of the African continent. In any event, I'm wondering, are they looking perhaps as somebody who might step in on the mitigation front?
It's a really fascinating question. Cecilia, do you have a comment there?
Yes, it's a fascinating question and also a very complicated one. The reason being, the last two COPs, we've avoided, I'll say we, but part of the parties, having conversations around mitigation ambition. And so the two, actually, I'll say three COPs, Sharm el-Sheikh, this last COP, and this COP that I'm in now. So the conversation around mitigation and, net zero is happening outside the process. We have set ambitious goals, but it's not happening inside. And we are seeing lots of innovation, whether it's on carbon capture or technologies, whether it's electric vehicles, engines that are not using fossil fuel. There's a lot of innovation happening outside the process. But the conversation on negotiating, limiting greenhouse gas emissions seems to be fading away from the process. And I think the responses and the answers are out there. Just listening to Arila now, I was quite fascinated because I didn't know that's happening. And the potential of the model she has described to us is something that's extremely, I really want to learn more about that. But also on the side, the methodologies and the approaches of things that are already happening, there's lots of resistance of bringing those discussions on the multilateral process. Look at SRM, solar radiation modification, for instance. We know it's happening. It's happening in some of the countries, but there is no governance structure on how some of those technologies are being applied or transparency in terms of how they are being utilized and the impacts they could have on future climate. So, so there's still so much around that needs to be interrogated. But what I hear more and more, and from Arila's intervention, there are solutions that are happening. We just need to find a space where these solutions can start coming to bear and where they do not need to go through negotiations. Because what people are seeking now is really action, whether it's mitigation action or adaptation action, for them, for humanity to survive.
Thank you, Cecilia. And do we have, I'm thinking we can do one or two more questions and then sort of head to closing remarks. But does anybody have a question for Laura as well? Feel free to share.
I have a question for Laura. We were in the breakout room where we were not able to ask questions, but the question for Laura is, can you give us some examples that you mentioned of cultural, how you're bridging the gaps and exactly what projects you're doing in RMI? Just to zoom in on island level, what is RMI doing?
Yes, yes. So for a little bit of context, I guess for the wider group who weren't in our room, one of my closing points that I think has been most surprising in work across islands internationally has been the value of cultural shift and the need for cultural shift. I think while we have a lot of effort in these big climate solutions, a lot of the workforce development programs really hinge on inclusivity. Just we know at a high level, Irina says that 32% of the clean energy workforce is represented by women. When you zoom in, the vast majority of those jobs is held in administrative positions. So we're not seeing women supporting the energy transition on a technical in technical positions, and we are not seeing women move through the ranks, as they say. So we're seeing a leaky pipeline of talent of women in the energy transition. So what's challenging there is a lot of it is cultural conversations. It's how are we supporting women in the workforce that are looking to make genuine change and are just not being, frankly, granted those opportunities. I've heard some really heartbreaking stories of women who are not put on projects despite being the most qualified person in the office because she just got married and who knows if she's going to get pregnant soon. Like it's really surprising how often these stories come up around the world. I think that we're a little bit siloed in the US and Canada, in Western Europe, to the realities of women globally. I think something that's interesting as well is the value of networks. So the follow-up part of this question was around what is RMI doing and what am I interested in seeing more of in the work. So I think something that's really valuable in the WIRE network, the Women in Renewable Energy Network, is that it's a professional development network for mid-career women. So women who are in the workforce and looking to move further. I joke a lot that mid-career kind of means nothing. It just means like you didn't just start and you're not done. So it's a vast majority of women who are looking for networks. Sometimes it's technical training opportunities, sometimes it's educational opportunities, but whatever conversation we're having becomes a personal conversation. So it's a lot about how are you supporting women in the realities of negotiation, in the realities of pitching themselves for certain projects or for new roles. How are women being empowered to reach out to role models, and do they have those role models available to them? Max, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. Working in climate tech, I don't see a lot of women in technical roles, even in the developed world. So it's a big problem. I had a related question that I wanted to ask to Cecilia, maybe like one final question, which is like, Cecilia, you've been in the UN for, I think, over 25 years. So you've been at the heart of these negotiations for a long time. And I know that the representation, just looking at the pictures coming out of COP, there's not a lot of women compared to men at the proceedings. Azerbaijan initially had an all-male organizing committee. There was backlash, so they added women. There is dedicated Gender Day coming up on November 21st to focus on gender issues. I know that's something that's on your mind, Cecilia. I'm curious, how is the role of women in COP and climate negotiations in general, how has it changed since you've been in the field? Are you seeing a lot of progress or is it still very slow?
On the side of managing the negotiations, it's been very deliberate on our side to ensure that we always have two co-facilitators, one male, one female. So that's helped quite a lot in terms of bringing that vibe into the room and ensuring that that balance is being maintained. For this COP, we had only 6 heads of state that were women out of the 73 heads of states that spoke and made their national statements in the last 2 days here in Baku. The other challenge we're facing is to ensure that gender is not just discussed as a standalone agenda item, but that it's mainstreamed in all the discussions, whether it's on adaptation, whether we are talking about indigenous people or just transitions, that we're ensuring that that conversation and debate, even in terms of making decisions, that it is taking provision and making sure that that the gender issues are well balanced across board. But I must say that whatever the case, we make one step forward, but it's 2 steps backwards. We haven't been able to reach a gender agreement in the last 2-3 COPs because of politics. And it's all a politics of agreeing. And basically it's a governance issue and agreeing under which body, whether it's the Convention on Climate Change or it's the Paris Agreement, that should lead the whole conversation of integration of gender. And for me, that also demonstrates the lack of representation even in national delegations, where we are still seeing predominantly men attending the UN climate change talks. So there's still a lot of work to be done to mainstream women, to place women in leadership positions, even in the ministries of climate, ministries of environment. There's still a lot to be done in that area. It's not about, I don't think it's about capacity, because when you go to the community initiatives that I've even been able to work with across the developing countries, a lot of the players and leaders at the community level are women. You know, I am a product of Professor Wangari Maathai, who was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and she was an activist, a climate environmental activist. And it's through her that I learned and got interested in this space. So we need many more women mentors. We need many more of us to show leadership and to be able to try and bring along one more or two more of us in order for us to be in that room and be present and influence the decision making. So we as women have a responsibility. We in Cleantech or we in other networks, we need to show that level of responsibility in bringing along one or two others to the table. So that's basically all I can say. I'm trying to do my bit, and I'm asking all of you to try and do your bit, just to hold hands of others and bring them along. Thanks.
You are embodying it. Thank you, Cecilia.
Well, you know what they say, if you want something done and done right, put a woman in charge, right? So, oh man, this has been really good.
We'll keep trying.
We're doing it. We're gonna make it happen. In closing, thank you, Max, for organizing this impressive panel. Tremendous amount of information, and we didn't even get to all of it. So thank you so much for all your leadership here. For those of you who don't know about our merch store, you can have WCS merch. So go ahead there and order what you like. If you're a member, I do believe you have a discount code. We got some really cool stuff in there. I think there's even like a baby onesie and stuff like that. You know what they say, start them young. Next slide, please. Thank you to all of our speakers. Like I said, a tremendous amount of intelligence and insight on that panel. So thank you all for your support of our beautiful blue-green space flower that we call home. Next slide, please. And thank you to our volunteers, all of our Zoom producers, Emily and Pravathi. Marika is our marketing coordinator. Denise is our events coordinator, and me and Max. Thank you so much. You can become a volunteer with this QR code. We always have a lot of fun here, so please join us and help make WCS the best it can be. Next slide. That might be the end of the. Yep. Give us your feedback. We take feedback as a form of kindness, as our chairwoman Sarah Fuentes always says. So please, big or small, send us your feedback, because we're always looking to improve. We do embody the concept of Kaizen here at WCS. Thank you very much. Next slide. I think this is the last one. Oh yes, the virtual world. We hang out here a lot as well. You can join us on all these channels, and this also will be this recording will go up on YouTube eventually, and LinkedIn is the most popular place where we all hang out. So those links are in the chat. You can check those off right there. And I do believe we've got to the last slide now. Thank you all for joining us, and let's see you again on another turn of this beautiful blue-green space flower we call home. Thank you so much. Have a great day.